those that are listening that don't know you, I have cool friends, and Don is a pretty cool guy. I'm about to make him blush by reading off some of his exploits. We used to have lunch together a couple times a week, but life has gotten us really busy in different tracks. But um, Don is, I would say, an ultra endurance athlete and adventurer. He's run marathons, ultra marathons, adventure races, anything from 5Ks to 100-mile races. Uh, he's done. He's started focusing more and transitioning more from road races in his earlier racing to more trail racing, and running what most of us mere mortals would be hiking with a pack. He runs it, and makes us all feel like we're just pansies out there. He's done the 100-mile wilderness. His education is in environmental studies, emergency medicine. He's a published journalist, and has done a lot in newspapers, magazines, articles. He's probably got a more intimate working knowledge of Katahdin and the surrounding wilderness of anyone that I know of that's alive. I mean, and I know or knew the trail masters for that region, and I think I don't even think that they would have the knowledge that Don has of that region there at the end of the Appalachian, the AT. He's a paramedic. He is a mountain runner, as I said, a winter snowboarding and ski patrol. And he likes awkward old country music.
Oh yeah,
And
give me some Merle Haggard any day.
we're gonna get into that. But when's the last time you've been up to see? When's the last time you've been up to see our friend Pomola?
Oh, what is today? Friday. So um, I'd have to look at my calendar, but it's within the past 2 weeks. So yeah,
So, so for our listeners who don't know who Pomola is, why don't you tell us?
yeah. Pomola is one of the Native American deities, a combination of an eagle and a moose, and lives somewhere up on Katahdin. Pomola Peak is named after him, which is the peak at the other end of the knife edge. So the knife edge has Baxter Peak or Katahdin at one end, and then there's Pomola at the other. So I've been fortunate in that I don't hear Pomola. I may feel Pomola when I'm up there, but I
Mm-hmm.
tend to stay away when it's stormy weather if I can. So yeah, yeah.
He used to
And I'm heading
not.
back on Monday.
Okay, you're heading back on Monday. So how many
Yeah.
times? And we're going to talk about Katahdin a little bit later. But how many times have you climbed that specific mountain?
I have, to be honest, lost track. Since getting these fancy GPS watches and having the ability to track and document things, whether it's Strava or Garmin, I could accumulate that data if I wanted to for how many times I've been on a particular peak, assuming that I've labeled that run or hike appropriately. But then there's all the years I didn't have that equipment, so less than a couple hundred, more than a couple dozen.
Yeah.
So on a good year, because of my current schedule the last several years, I'll probably be up there anywhere between 12 and 15 or more times a summer/fall. So yeah.
And to give people, I mean, really, this is true no matter where you live in Maine, and forget about New England, but give people a little bit of a sense of what it takes to get from your apartment in Fort Kent to the base of the mountain to ascend that, to ascend that mountain.
Um,
This
yeah.
isn't this isn't a parking lot off the interstate.
No, this isn't the Appalachia Trailhead, on the north side of Mount Washington or Pinkham Notch. For those people who don't know what that is, or what those places are. I'm not familiar with the Adirondacks, so I don't know what those trailheads are like. But when certainly New Hampshire is, the White Mountains in New Hampshire are geared towards outdoor pursuits and tourists, and it's been that way for years and years. That's how that's how New Hampshire made its name. So they're very accustomed to that. And Baxter is a totally different story, and Maine in general is a different story. So for anyone, this podcast goes around the world, but for anyone that doesn't know where Fort Kent is, basically, if you look at the top of the state, you don't think anyone lives up there, and you'd be right.
No one but us.
Yeah, thankfully. But yeah, Katahdin, just to get, it's about 3 hours of pavement driving, and then another 45 minutes of driving on basically a thin dirt gravel road that's inside the park. So, and it's extremely popular. Maybe we'll talk about this, within the broader context of Baxter and its history and management and things like that. But it's really popular, so it has very limited day use parking, and they try to limit the number of people, especially on Katahdin, because it's the most popular. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is truly, the park is an animal all its own in many ways. It has a lot of the natural beauty and there's been a lot of debate over the years as to whether or not it should be a national park, and a lot of pushes toward that. It is a state park, but not your typical state park. You want to explain why it's a state park, but not a state park? You want to explain that?
Well, you know a lot about this as well, but within the last couple of decades, it's fallen under a little bit more of the state, at least, umbrella as far as the hierarchy goes, and that's, I think, primarily a factor of government always tends to grow, and so they wanted a little more, continuous oversight, or at least somebody wanted oversight. But Baxter's history is pretty interesting. It's all privately purchased land that Governor Baxter purchased from various landowners, and then donated to the state with some deeded restrictions, and a lot of legal paperwork that lawyers would have a blast with, and I'm sure still haggle over. Yeah, so it's a state park in the sense that it's controlled by the state, and it's a park, but it's not a state park with a capital S and a capital P. So it has its own governance body that is very different from any other state park.
Yeah, and the head of Baxter, if I remember right, and this may have changed since you're saying there has been some changes, but back 20 years ago, whoever the head of the Baxter State Park was, he once a year had to present himself annually to a panel of state officials. But other than that, he was kind of the lawmaker authority within the park, kind of the rule setter kind of thing, and had much more authority within the park than say someone would in another park within the state.
Yeah. The park, it's the head, the official governing people are the current state AG, the Attorney General, head of the Forest Service. It may be somebody else. I can't remember. As far as the people who oversee the park from the highest level, and then there's, I'm sure, various advisory boards as well. But yeah, the Baxter Park director is the director, and everyone in the park works, for them, whether it's a he or a she, and then they have different, divisions. It's a huge tract of land, but their staffing is pretty minimal as far as what they have to maintain.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into this a little bit later in our conversation, and talk about you mostly at the beginning. But since we're digging into this right now, and we don't want to get into bore our listeners with too much of the legal aspects of it. What makes Katahdin in particular, but Baxter State Park has a lot of great peaks, as you know better than anyone. But what for someone who looks at the elevation of Katahdin and says, "I'm not impressed. I live in the Rocky Mountains. I'm not impressed." Explain to them why they should be impressed by this mountain and what makes it so unique in the Appalachian Mountain Range.
It just when they relocated A-Ball, which is one of the trails going up several years ago, I think that was the first switchback section that mountain ever got, which is typical for New England. People out west that are used to switchbacks to get uphill, they come and do New England. And I've done a number of trail races, and I know a lot of trail runners, and there's the term New England technical, which is roots, rocks, and you don't need switchbacks. If there's a big bunch of rocks, you just go over them. So A-Ball, when they did reroute it, they have some nice switchbacks. So that's a little bit of an easier route than it had been. But it is a lot above tree line, and it has its hard sections, but it has its rewarding. There's a tableland on top. We can talk about the geology and geography, but it has just enough breaks where if you want to, bust your butt, you can, and you can make it an all-day affair, but you get some nice breaks. And that's just the physical aspect of it. There's the whole, Native American, Penobscot Nation, it being a sacred mountain, for the Native people. So it definitely has a lure, different than Mount Washington, which has its worst weather in the world. Katahdin also has a trail called a Knife Edge, which I've been on in gale wind and spitting rain. So yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So for people who are a little bit more familiar with, let's say, Mount Washington, the tallest mountain in New England, in New Hampshire, when we compare the two, for example, yes, Mount Washington is taller, but it starts at a higher elevation than Katahdin does. Katahdin is very near sea level, and while Katahdin might not be the tallest peak in the Appalachian Mountain Range, it is, from what I understand of the entire Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, it is the longest continual ascent of any mountain in that range. Is that right?
I'd have to double check that, but if you're going up Hunt Trail, which is the name that Baxter Park has for the trail on the western side that the AT is. So the AT, of course, is a collection of differently named trails for the most part. So Hunt Trail is a nice 4-mile hump up a mountain that's pretty steady uphill. And yeah, so Katahdin is like an island amongst flat land. Actually, Baxter itself, the whole park, because you have Traveler up north and a few other peaks. But as far as the tallest mountain, yeah, it sticks out in the middle of a rather flat section of Maine for sure.
And it's great that you brought that up because we call it part of the Appalachian Mountain Range, and it's part of the Appalachian Trail. But to your point, the Appalachian Mountains, the White Mountains in particular, that run the border of Maine and New Hampshire, are a long way off. You can see them really well on a clear day, but they're a long way off from Katahdin. And Katahdin, as you said, you have what Henry David Thoreau, when he climbed it, more than a century ago, he said it looked like a shattered mirror of all these little ponds and streams down below him. But everything is, pretty much flat, a lot like the northern Minnesota, those areas where they have lots and lots and lots of lakes. It's very similar to that, but then you have this very dramatic mountain that just comes up out of the ground. And there's a geological reason for that, right? Can you explain that to us?
It's a big plume of, volcanic rock that found a weak spot and popped up, and then part of it got sloughed away by glaciers. But yeah, I've been up on Katahdin, at sunrise and at different times of the day, and you can't look at a view and not see at least a half dozen lakes. Some of them, vast, and then a lot of them little tiny things that you just see them shimmering. So yeah, there's no easy trail up Katahdin, and there's no point where there's not a good view, unless you're clouded in, of course. But
Mhm.
that has an allure of its own.
Yeah, and you're right with all the various ascents. It's like when people ask what's the easiest way up, I'm like, because they've all they've all got their pros, they've all got their cons, and other than Pomola, obviously that one takes the cake. But and speaking of, you were talking about the knife's edge. That's the only, I think, the only ascent I haven't done is across the knife's edge, and it hasn't. I am uh, terribly bad with heights. I am a 3 points of contact guy. I, I'm not a goat that just scurries across these boulders on a knife's edge. But that said, it's not been for a lack of desire. I really want to do it, but you cannot drive to the park, hike Katahdin via Knife's Edge, get back down, and then drive out. Like I mean, you could because you run these trails, but us mere mortals, we need to be sleeping in the park the night before if we intend on doing the Knife's Edge, because it takes significantly longer, right? Because it's technical.
Yeah, that's and I can't remember the last time that I have day hiked Katahdin. Um, I day hike at the north end of the park because that's only a couple hours away from me, and Traveler's a beautiful, nice 10-mile loop, and I can drive and do that in a day. But yeah, so Katahdin, there are hotels, motels in campgrounds in Millinocket, but if you're not staying in the park the night before, it makes for a very long day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you don't mind starting a little bit before dawn and driving home in the dark, you can do it. But you're gonna be tuckered out, and I know a lot of people do because those day parking lots are full. Basically every weekend in the summer and every weekday starting in late August, because you have leaf peepers, you have AT through hikers that are the northbound, the Nobos,
Mm-hmm.
that are finishing, so they have family and friends meeting them, and the end of the season can be a bit of a party with the AT through hikers, which
Mm-hmm.
can be fun, but can also sort of shatter that I'm in the wilderness and I'd like some solitude.
And the spirit, yeah,
Yeah,
and to the point that we keep alluding to, that very spiritual sense of place that you get when you're there. There's
yeah,
Katahdin means the greatest mountain, and it's for a reason. I mean, if you live anywhere in uh, Maine, it just is such a significant and prominent place that you could understand very easily how it would have a spiritual significance to the natives of the state.
sure. I mean, if you can imagine traveling up and down the Penobscot and all its tributaries in that central Maine area, and every time you can see beyond the trees or any low-lying hill and you can see any distance, you can see Katahdin.
Mm-hmm.
You're going down Route 11 or Interstate 95, for miles and miles, you can see it coming at you and receding from you as you're traveling. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
And
let's shift gears. We'll come back to this, but let's shift gears, and I want to ask you what started your love affair with nature. As long as I've known you, and we've known each other for about 20 years, I think. As long as I've known you, you've been extremely passionate about the outdoors. And so, how did that get started with you?
yeah. Well, I grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and when people think of Massachusetts, they think of Boston, they think of cities, but Western Mass is um, heavily forested. You have, whether it's Wadsworth or these other, nature metaphysical writers, from
Mhm.
centuries past, all have New England, Massachusetts type of connections. And anyone who's driven 495 around Boston, you see cities, but then when you're not seeing cities, you're seeing a lot of trees. So it's right up against New Hampshire. And as a kid, we would spend a lot of time going to the White Mountains in New Hampshire. So I was very familiar. Um, I spent a lot of time with around Mount Washington and the White Mountains. So I was very familiar with everything around Pinkham Notch, and of course Mount Monadnock, which either Mount Monadnock or Fuji. I think it flips every so often for the most hiked mountain in the world. And Fuji's down in southern New Hampshire. Monadnock's down in southern New Hampshire. So I spent a lot of time camping and hiking and backpacking. So I always had that exposure to nature, and my family is very good about going to even local parks for swimming and all that sort of stuff, and camping and things. So yeah, it was always in my background. And then of course when I went to the University of Maine at Fort Kent, I selected that for the environmental studies program.
Mhm.
So that was a good exposure, to
Yeah, and
being.
I think both of us. I think that's probably where our friendship started. We were both in and out of there about the same time. I was going for biology with a focus in zoology, and I believe you were environmental studies, right?
Environmental studies was the the name of the program. And then I worked in natural resource management, up in the Fort Kent area for the Soil Conservation Office for a number of years, and then ended up working at the University of Maine at Fort Kent. So I never really left for a number of years. So I didn't grow up hunting, but I ended up doing quite a bit of hunting after college graduation, more as an excuse to get out in the woods,
Hmm. Hmm.
and especially work with the Labrador I had at the time. But really, just to get
Yeah,
out. I was never one to drive around and hunt. For bird hunting, that's one technique. I would find a place to park and walk the old skid roads and
hmm.
field edges
I
and
remember
things
that
like.
was a big loss for you when your lab passed away.
Yeah, yeah. Hawkeye was a
Are you still
fantastic
there?
yellow Labrador retriever. Hmm?
There you go.
Yeah, he was
Go
my
ahead.
duck dog. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, Hawkeye was my great Labrador Retriever duck dog. He was, and I haven't done much hunting since he passed away. So I've
Hmm.
gotten more into
Hmm.
the non firearms outdoor. I still like to shoot. I just don't get out in the woods and hunt very much.
And that's the same with me. I when I got out of the Marine Corps, I started hunting and was successful for a couple years. But my passion for dog sledding, as you know, deer season is also conditioning training season for the sled dog team. And so, about one or two seasons of sitting in a tree stand thinking I could be training my dogs right now. I could be training my dogs right
Yeah.
now. And I let go of hunting. I mean, I'll still go occasionally if I get invited by some friends who are going out to their sporting camps or whatever. But for the most part, it's the same. And I can't remember his name right now, but the author that did Winter Dance and Hatchet just passed away a couple years ago, a great author, but he started out the same way. He started trapping with his sled dogs as an excuse to go out with his sled dogs, and
That's a good
eventually
idea.
said,
I like
"Yeah."
that.
And then eventually he was like, I don't really need this trapping part of it. I'm just
Yeah.
gonna stick with the dogs." So I have to ask, like, your career has you like on call, and you're because you're a paramedic, you're on for long blocks of time, and then you're off for a block of time that really permits you to have this love affair that you have with Katahdin and Baxter State Park. Did you choose your profession to give you that downtime, or did it happen? Just happen?
I No, because initially the schedule wasn't exactly like that. In the sense that I'm on what we call on duty, so I'm at the station for sometimes 12-hour shifts, usually 24, and sometimes back-to-back 24-hour shifts. It's low volume in Fort Kent, so you can do those longer shifts. You wouldn't be able to do that in Portland or Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be that I would also be required to technically be on call. So they would expect for me another couple of days to be not at the station, but to be available, um, if a second call or transfer comes in. And so for the last 5 or more years anyway, I haven't had that requirement to be on call. If I choose to work some overtime, I do. So in the winter, I tend to do that more because the summer and fall are usually when I do my vacations. And I call it a vacation. I rarely have to use vacation time because I just use the time that I'm not on duty. So, so it helped in that way, that this is not a 9 to 5 day a week, and I'm restricted to the weekends. So it definitely has its advantages. The disadvantage is I could be awake for 24 to 30 hours at a time doing long transfers and calls in the middle of the night. So sometimes my non-work days are spent catching up on sleep. It's not all going out to Baxter
Yeah.
Park and playing. And there are chores to do at home. So,
Sure.
but I will admit I do maximize, between June and October, the ability to get out in the woods or the mountains, either here or traveling down to Baxter or mid-coast Maine. Yeah.
So how did, and I think I remember you saying you really fell in love with running about 10 years ago. Um, how did that come about? Was it just, I want to see this and I want to go further. So in order to go further, I'm going to go faster. How did you get into endurance,
Yeah.
really ultra endurance running?
I had always, like I said, spent a lot of time hiking and backpacking in the White Mountains. So I've done, a number of backpacking trips. And I don't know, maybe when I was younger, it wasn't as hard to carry, 50, 60 pounds in a backpack and sleep in a potentially wet tent, and then do it again the next day. Um, I did do the 100-mile wilderness, which was a veterans fundraiser, 100-mile wilderness backpack, with a bunch of guys. That was about a 6-day trip, and it rained for part of that. So that was enjoyable because I had company, but it wasn't physically pleasant all the time. And not that things have to be pleasant. Obviously, when you're running mountains and doing physical fitness and things like that of any kind, part of the challenge is the discomfort. I think too much comfort is a bad thing. And then there's the gear. You just got to keep buying a new backpack, and you have to do a lot of meal planning. And so I drifted away from the backpacking. I still like the camping because it puts you right in the thick of things as far as where you want to go for hiking. And then running, I've always, as a kid, I biked more, road biking, and of course with the backpacking. And then I was a gym rat for a while, which I see you post some pictures lifting weights sometimes. So I got away from the gym rat thing and then got in and out of running before I had kids. And then really, like I said, the last 10 plus years have been, started off with road running, and then just the scenery is not as nice. There's traffic, and the pavement is not healthy for you to run on.
Yeah.
As far as me, yes, you can twist an ankle on a rock, but it's also, I don't like the mechanical nature, and I've run road marathons. You have to be a robot to really do well. It's a lot of mechanical, repetitive, and it's a big mind game, which I enjoy. But I drifted away from the road work and started doing more trail work. So you just basically have to give up pace. The idea of your road pace is not going to be anything like your trail pace. So there's a big ego hit. But the upside is look at the beautiful places you get to run. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have I wouldn't have seen the scenery in Bryce, Utah, or the Canadian coast, or any of these other places where I've run trail races. Um, if I'd only run in Chicago Marathon or Portland, or these road races. So that was the big attraction for me: is less people and more
More
scenery.
nature. Yeah, more
Yeah,
nature.
yeah.
Yeah. So what you did over time was you took your passion for nature and your passion for running, and you married them together. And sometimes when I see your run times, or how quickly you get to the peak of Katahdin, and I shake my head and I'm like, man, I yeah. What would you say? Speaking of which, what would you say to people who would suggest that kind of ultra running, marathon running, trail running, that long term, because a lot of people say this, that long term that kind of running is not good for your body. You obviously, we're about the same age. You're a little bit older than I am, but you're in excellent shape. You're in excellent health. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, knock on wood that I have
Mhm.
not had any serious injuries. I banged my knee a little bit last week, which I wasn't even running. I was just moving my leg between a rock, and I looked down and said, I hope I don't hit my knee on that. And then I caught it. So that hasn't really hobbled me because I've been doing some running. It's just I can't do quite as intense the workouts as I would until that's healed. Each person's different. Obviously, there are marathon runners who do strictly road and you know go into their 40s, 50s, 60s and have no issues at all. And then there are people that have knee issues and hip issues. So if you do it right, and pay attention to what your body is telling you, and make adjustments, then you can do just about any sort of physical fitness you want, into an older age. Uh, the definite thing about ultra running is if you're going to push the limits of energy consumption, that sort of butts up against good decision making. And that's where pacers come in. So these ultra runners that are running 100-mile, 200-mile races, um, and even more now, 200 is the new 100, and which doesn't make any sense to me because it's double, but still. But so if you have pacers, to be aware that you're hallucinating, after being awake for 24 plus hours and burning through, I don't know how many thousands of calories, and potentially dehydration and maybe some nausea and vomiting, that you have somebody there to help with some guideposts. But not everyone has good pacers or pacers at all, and not all race courses are um, as safe and easy as others. So that's I think the downside is the physical exhaustion factor that you come up against, because when you're running more than 26 miles, so anything more than a marathon technically is an ultra. So you could run 30 miles and you've completed an ultra. Um, but 30 is not that much more than 26, right? And really, if you're a good marathon runner, 26 miles is kind of a sprint, right? Because you might not need very many calories if you're an efficient marathon runner, and you may or may not even need to hydrate very much, depending on your condition and what the weather conditions are like. But once you start getting 40, 50-mile plus in, you have to be concerned about energy and hydration, because that's going to affect your decision making. And decision making on the trails is
Mhm.
is really key. Uh,
Mhm.
and you basically talk to ultra runners and ultra trail runners specifically, in that there's a lot of walking. If you're doing a 100-mile race, unless you're Kilian Jornet, these elite people, you're going to be doing a lot of walking or speed hiking, because part of the strategy has to be I can only consume so much energy, and I need to expend that in a wise fashion. And if you don't
Mhm.
get that balance right, you end up with nausea, vomiting, and then your energy stores are down, and then you end up walking anyway because you have zero energy. So
You crashed.
yeah, the technical part of whether you're going to trip or fall, um, that's that's either here nor there. Depends on what trail you're on. I've read books and articles about runners that have had horrific accidents, because they slipped and a boulder fell on them, and all these sort of um, things, and that just accidents happen. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a couple. I have three questions for you. One of them's pretty petty, and then the other one is quite heavy. So do you want petty or heavy first? Which?
Oh, let's do the petty one first, because now I'm curious. And no, I will not leave you behind if you come to hike Katahdin with me.
Oh
That a
yes, you
question?
would. You absolutely would. No. So here's the petty question. There is a famous book, "Lost on a Mountain in Maine," about
Yeah.
the harrowing true story of a boy who got separated from his hiking party, and I don't know, I can't remember the details, but spent, what was it, 2 weeks traversing the North Maine woods alone before he came out. And when I talked to you and said I'd love to have you on my podcast, you said, "Well, here's something that we could talk about." You said, "I think that story's BS."
I think I said hoax. I don't think I said BS. No.
So man, I mean, that's a famous book, and it's still, it's touted in classrooms. It's I just came out of registered guide training, and there's many references to it even in there. So talk to me, man. Why do you feel like it's a hoax?
Oh, I was half joking in that I had just come off the mountain, and I thought, how could anyone get get lost? But then I reconsider the trails. If you go right instead of left, you're going towards Saddle instead of back down towards Hunt. So that could get you over towards Hamlin, but then you'd have to go from Hamlin down into the valley towards
Which takes
Russell
you right back
Pond.
down. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so you'd have to skip Russell Pond and end up somehow at the north end of the Wasataquoik Valley, and then follow that east and south. Um, and I thought, how could they do that and not come across any other trail? So that's what I kind of jokingly said. I don't know,
Well,
but
and
but I don't know what the trails were like in the 30s when this
well,
happened.
that's what I was about to say. Is it was still recovering from its ravaging. I mean, when Baxter bought the park, it looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off there. And,
Yeah,
so
especially around Russell Pond and those places they could access.
yeah. So I mean, to your point again, I think one should be able to, see quite far for, especially when they're up on the mountain or coming down the ridge or whatever. But um, yeah,
But
I would think actually it would be more traversed, because of all the logging roads and trails and camps and stuff that would have still been around that we find, um, relics of in the woods right now. It would seem
yeah,
that.
yeah, if you get north of the Wasataquoik stream, you're up by New City and Old City, and those places where you can find actual old leaf springs and other barrel implements and logging implements, things like that. I I guess if I can now in worldwide podcast amend my original comment, my half joking comment to
Well,
you.
this is no fun.
Yeah. Plus, he's a kid, and it would have been a heck of a hoax to pull off. Um, but I just think it's a real amazing story. I don't think it is unheard of for people to survive that sort of thing. And humans, as you know, are like coyotes. They're adaptable to
Hmm.
anything and everywhere, and especially kids who have no preconception of having world weary stories about desperation. It's just they just keep going. So I just thought, yeah. if I was expecting to go down Hunt and I end up going up Hamlin, I would have figured something's wrong, which made me think, how could you go that far? But that's just because I have that information. I have that experience on the mountain, and
Mhm.
I doubt that as a young man that person had been up on the mountain and knew the trails as well as I did, or
Mhm.
as well as I do. So yeah, now that you've outed me, and the film's out, I'm not going to be allowed to go to the theater and see the film if I if I ever go near.
I told you it was a petty question. I told you it was petty. And then a little heavier one. When I think about all the conversations you and I have had over the years, um, and we talked about it a little bit today leading up to this interview, faith, spirituality. When I think of you and your the kind of your philosophy and approach to these things over the years, kind of what I've gotten from you is a Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, Muir kind of outlook on these things, and so I have a two-part question for you, and first is those New England philosophers of the early mid 1800s. What effect, if any, have they had and their writings on shaping your perspective of your relationship with the outside world? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is you said to me, I'm not a man of faith in the traditional sense, but I do have a spiritual connection with the mountains. And so I'd like for you after you talk a little bit about those early New England philosophers and their influence or lack thereof on your outlook. I'd like for you to just dive into that statement that you made a little bit more.
Uh, sure. The being a bit of a writer myself, as far as journalism, and being an avid reader, I enjoy the writing style of those early authors as well as the content. So that's a big appeal. It's a totally different style of writing than what you see today.
Mhm.
Um,
You could tell, and here's the thing: I grew up in a King James culture in the Bible Belt of the South,
hmm,
and when I read them, like Muir, he was preacher's kid, and in New England, very, and so I hear the echoes of the King James Bible in their writings so much that. And you have to keep in mind that back then that was the school reader. That
oh,
was.
exactly. Yeah. 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 So, and obviously today's authors have different um, experiences, and I think religion in general has a different place in the majority of at least American society. If you're even in the Bible Belt, there are less people wearing that Bible Belt, I think. So, um, at least in as much as that it is not as intimate a fabric of their lives as it was, in generations past. So yeah, I definitely agree with you in that point. And you definitely hear, the preachers tempo and style in that, and the biblical style, but the content as well. And part of, you mentioned, I said I wasn't a man of faith in the traditional sense. Is what I mentioned to you. Pre-interview. Um, I get the sense that these writers had a sense of a God in the deity sense, but not that religion is what they were anchored to. It was the concept of something bigger than themselves, something that, yes, may have been the creator, um, and may have been the orderer of things as we see them, but that we are still interpreting what we see and what we interact with. So we have some responsibility for that, in that it's not just a matter of bowing down to what's written and then asking for forgiveness when we screw up. It's that we have to be aware of what's around us and take responsibility for our actions and our words. And part of that being aware of what's around us is, like Emerson and Thoreau, you've got to get in it. You get to get in it to know what it is. It's great to be an academic, but if if you're a wolf researcher and all you do is sit behind a computer screen tabulating data, you're not really going to know what it's like to have a sense of what wolves are or what a wolf pack is or does. So that's kind of what I appreciated. And I like Marcus Aurelius and I like all these other writers. That sort of philosophical strain is just real interesting because it's something beyond our everyday experience. I can and I do read EMS journals and fiction but and the daily news, unfortunately. But to get beyond what we interact with on a regular basis is always interesting, I think.
Yeah. Before you get to the second part of my question, there's a few things that you said that just triggered some thoughts in my mind. Coming as I have from a very traditional, like I said, King James Bible Belt South. When I look at the writings of those men, like, nature is God's first temple, Muir said, specifically relating to the mountains, which you're very passionate about. And, and I read so many of these things where they're taking the philosophy into nature, into the natural world. And so for me, like for someone who comes from a secular mindset and reads them, they see this as almost conflicting with the whatever Judeo-Christian tradition,
Mm-hmm.
but having that very strong religious foundation that I had, when I hear it, and I think, and I could be wrong, but I think having that foundation that I had is similar to the foundation that they had before they started writing. And so for me, I see it as an obvious expression and outcropping of of some very neglected parts of Judeo-Christian philosophy and theology. For example, the things of God are clearly seen by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So they are without excuse. Like, and the Bible, says, doesn't nature itself teach you this and that? And you can see these things through the things that are made. And so I said all that to say, what triggered in my mind when you were talking was something C.S. Lewis said when he was talking to some soldiers in World War II. He was, kind of doing the whole travel around, encourage the troops and
Yeah.
everything. And this soldier said, I don't want to hear about the book. I don't want to hear about what's written. He said, I have, been out there and I've experienced God in nature, so I don't need what is written. And what I liked that C.S. Lewis said in response to that was, he said, you can have a map of the ocean and it's just a map, right? Or you can stand on the shore of the ocean and feel the wind coming from the ocean, feel the spray of the ocean, feel the power of the waves and all like that. And he said, when you stand on the shore of the ocean without the map, that one experience is all you know of the ocean. But the map will show you that there's other parts of this ocean. There's there are the tropics. There's the Arctic regions. There's this shore in America and this shore on Europe, and so the map the map together with the experience, standing there on the ocean, like both of those things are meant to feed into each other and not to cancel each other out. And I really thought that was really kind of cool. And I think that we see these themes, the Native American themes of the Great Spirit, and you see this in Celtic and even Scandinavian mythologies and theologies. We see these themes all the time, over and over and over again. And yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there and say that I think that oftentimes we see the New England philosophies of that time period as being a real, and it was a departure, but it was a departure only because Christianity had become um, so institutionalized that
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like a huge break. But when you just look at the map, you see a lot of what's in the ocean in the map if you're looking for it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's super interesting that the first thing you said, you would, because of your background and your education, your theological education, that you have a different and in some ways a deeper connection with those authors because you have a similar background and intellectual and emotional context to draw from when you read their works. And then, yeah, the map in the experience, from the time of prehistory when there were cave drawings. All cultures have storytellers, right? So, and part of the storytelling is to fill in the gaps that you have when you've only stood on that one spot on the shore, or when you have yet to travel to the shore. So, um, I think that's a very important thing. There's people, you can seek experiences, and that's fantastic. And if you accumulate experiences, you're probably going to end up wanting to talk to people about them and maybe write it down, and then you become the storyteller, you become the
Mm-hmm.
map maker, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can also start that journey early from the other side and take along some maps or some books, or do some, some pre-reading, have some stories told to you about places you are planning to go or have yet to go. It might
Yeah.
inspire you, to do some exploring. So I find the mountains. I always bring books when I go camping. I've been known to throw books in my running vest and take a break on top and read books. Not always these New England philosophers, actually rarely the New England
Yeah.
philosophers. It tends to be whatever I'm reading at the time. I've read some great military history books, Up on the Top of the Owl, some really
Mm-hmm.
touching, personal, tragic military stories, from modern war. And it puts you in a different, when you're reading a book alone on a mountain and it's about combat air traffic controller, over in the Middle East, and that that particular tragic incident, and I'm sitting on a mountain um, that has some similarities that put it in a
Mm,
different sort of context than if I was reading in my living room chair. So
sure, that makes sense.
yeah,
That makes sense. So, what do you feel with that spiritual connection with the mountains?
yeah.
What do you feel? What is that feeling? When do you feel it? Can you describe it? Is it something that you can describe?
Well, I'll try. Right, this is a podcast, so we've got to keep the chat going. I've had an interesting. I've had a different. My relationship with religion and spirituality has changed. I'm in my mid 50s and grew up in a not particularly strict but a religious family, um, and then started to learn about science and sort of drifted away from that. Those questions, the answers didn't make any sense to me.
Hmm.
Um, and but always being drawn to nature, there's things that you wonder, how in the world did this get here? And yes, I can read about geology and earth processes and
Hmm.
forestry and all that sort of stuff. But there's still, there's always things that you wonder at, even if you
Hmm.
don't wonder how, you're still wondering at them.
Hmm.
So, oftentimes in the park, usually my first day and my last day at the park, I always say some thank you to just,
Yeah.
this is thanks for another good season.
Yeah.
I love going for ice cold swims in the streams, by the campgrounds or whatnot. And I often find myself just that cleansing aspect of it is I've cleaned the worries from my day because
Your baptism.
yeah, it was a long day. So there's that baptismal aspect. There's the, you know, just again, thankful. And, whether it's, yeah, baptism or, a lot of religions have traditions of washing the hands and the feet, the
Mhm.
face before eating and all that sort of stuff. So, um, yeah, my connection is just how can you not be up on Katahdin and not look around and say, well, this is there's something beyond me. And I've been on fast runs and long runs where my mind is really focused on the physical performance, the gear, the technical terrain, the timing, um, in my nutrition and all this stuff because I'm trying to get, a personal best or checking out a new trail. So I try not to get caught up in that. But once you either break tree line or you come across a stand of maple that's, here in a couple of weeks, it's going to be perfect up in the park. So where there's this orange that you don't think you've quite seen that color before, or wow, I turn the corner and there's a moose looking me right in the eye.
Yeah.
Um, there's a logical explanation, a scientific explanation for all that stuff, but um, it still doesn't prevent the, that glimmer of the magisterial unknown
Hmm.
that
And
you.
what you're feeling is, well, I think it was 2,500 years ago, and he's still considered one of the greatest poets of all times, the warrior poet King David. He verbalized pretty much what you're saying. When I consider the stars, the workmanship of your hand. Um, who am I that you're mindful of me? What is the Son of Man that you visit me? Like it puts us in this, it immediately sets us in this place of realizing like just how vast and how majestic, this created universe is that we're living in. It's a spectacular thing. And, not to go off on a tangent too much, but um, I actually did kind of the opposite. I had a massive faith crisis back about 16 years ago, where I'd lost a son, had gone through a divorce. A lot of things happened within about a year period of time, and I just said, get out of the driver's seat, God. If this is the best you can do, I'm taking over from here. And what it was going back to college and studying science that actually restored my faith in God for the same reasons that you listed earlier. I believe that there is, you can tell the artist of some paintings by the brushstrokes on the work of art, and you see such continuity and such, the reason we can explore science, the reason we can explore the universe is because there are discernible patterns. That's how we discover things, because there are these discernible patterns that are set in motion. And, so for me, I just kept coming back to, here are these patterns again, and I see these patterns, and I see design here. And for me, it was like, okay, if there's design, then there's a designer. And
Yeah.
if there's structure, then there needs to be an engineer. And so, and whether that happened, over thousands of years or billions of years or whatever, the universe is just so structured that it really brought me back to a faith in a creator, and wanting to have a relationship with that creator. So yeah, that was my spiritual journey, actually, through science, back to faith. So
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting um, thing for you to write about. I think, if science is primarily or only used to disprove faith, then it's a disservice to
hmm
both.
hmm
Um, Unfortunately, that does get uh, done sometimes. I think for the majority, it's not. It's just that quest for figuring out how something works, and you can take that down to the smallest level, and eventually you're not going to be able to answer the
yeah.
questions.
Yeah, the one of the best things that I learned in studying biology was the concept of irreducible complexity.
Hmm.
That, let's take a single-celled organism with a flagellum. I think there are 46 parts, if I remember right, that make that flagellum on that single-celled organism work. And if any one of those 46 proteins were not there or out of place, that flagellum wouldn't work. So you've got this irreducible complexity there. And when I see those, and people find what they're looking for. If people are looking for a reason, not to have, any kind of faith or belief, then they will. And if people are looking, I think, they'll find what they're looking for too. And I'm sure that there was some part of me looking, to have hope again, and to believe again. And for me, I found it. But yeah, that was kind of my spiritual journey back to faith. But so what's next for Don Eno? What excites you? What makes you anxious that you're looking forward to? Goal, plan, like what are you working on? What are you planning on doing that scares you? Let's hear it.
Well, I have two daughters, one of which just got married a couple of weeks ago.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Yeah.
And the other one is going to be graduating college next May. So, grandchildren eventually, that's that's going to be the big challenge for me. I'm already gray. I know this isn't a video podcast, but if I grew in a beard, it would not be as sexy as yours. So,
I got two gray streaks right here.
um, like I said before, or I'm not sure if we mentioned it specifically, but I don't do very many races anymore. There are some destination races. My attempt at Bryce was a DNF after 20 something miles, and at least 15 of that probably was vomiting. So I got picked up by um, the course sweeper, which is the
Uh,
person that goes around and picks up all
oh
the
yeah,
flags.
yeah.
So when she caught me, I was like, okay, this is probably not going to be good. Um, so eventually, those of us that DNF'd prior to the last aid station got a ride, and then I got an IV and some fluid. So I'd like to go back and try that. There are some races in Colorado that I would like to try maybe someday, just again, destination races.
hmm
So in the immediate future, I've got 4 days, no, 5 days in Baxter next week. I've got a weekend at the north end of the park at the beginning of October, and then 4 more days down near Katahdin in the middle of October. So basically, right up against when camping ends.
hmm
So there'll be some more trail running and maybe some PR attempts because fall is the best time. There's no heat exhaustion.
hmm
Um, but I think training for the last year or more, I've had a running coach to help me stay on track and to help me with some focused training. So Oh, the other thing I have coming up actually is running the International Appalachian Trail in the monument, which,
Yeah.
good Lord, we haven't even talked about the monument. If you want to get controversial, let's talk about wolves and the monument and Baxter all in one podcast. But there's a section of the IAT, about half of which really is actually old roads through the monument. So in October, I've got that. No, actually, the first weekend in November, I've got that. That's a 27-mile north to south
Nice.
trail run. So
That is a long by monument for people who are unfamiliar. I did mention there's been an ongoing debate as to whether or not there should be a national park where Baxter State Park is in Katahdin. And since there's been a lot of kickback from certain groups about that not happening, the federal government created a monument through Roxanne Quimby's donation of land. And it's a long piece of land that kind of almost wraps around the eastern side of the park, right?
yeah, it's a bunch of land basically between the eastern Baxter boundary and the east branch of the Penobscot River. So it has some real pretty country in it, and it has some recently logged and old camps, primarily along the East Branch. But and I did a little run there last month, and it's interesting country because Maine has for a long time was a working force, and it still is. So people think they're not gonna when they go into a park or the wilderness, they're not gonna see anything
Mm-hmm.
man-made. Well, that doesn't happen in Maine. You're
Yeah.
going to come across old woods roads, old woods camps, old clear cuts. Um, so it's interesting, and that's a. I'm glad that Roxanne Quimby donated that land. There's always going to be controversy because there's use restrictions, and so
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
traditional uses for local people have been either eliminated or severely restricted in some cases. So
Okay.
yeah, that's a whole other kettle of fish to talk about
Mm-hmm.
that because I
Mm-hmm.
know people who cannot stand the fact that the monument was created. Yeah,
Yeah. There's it's beyond the scope of our conversation, but that's unfortunate because when you and I were going through college, one of the big sales pitches for a national park and preserve, and forest land was that all of the traditional uses of hunting, trapping, fishing, all of these things that we all love doing would actually be more liberal than what's currently allowed in Baxter State Park. That was the sales pitch that was being given, 15 years ago.
yeah, and it's the motorized use like snowmobiles and ATVs that are being restricted in a lot of these deeded reserves or these donated properties. Yes, the state or the feds can have it, but there shall be no snowmobiles or ATVs
Hmm.
because the people donating the land they're more advocates of the non-motorized. So there's a lot of hiking, mountain biking trails, cross country trails. There are a number of wealthy people that have built fantastic cross country skiing facilities and trails, and they're basically
Are
free to use.
are they grooming those trails like they
Yep.
would say down? Okay, okay,
Yeah. There's a Penobscot River Trails, which is on the Grindstone Road, which is free to rent the equipment. It's free to use the groomed trails and the heated lodge. So really, there's a push for that, and then there's cross country ski trails in the monument and the surrounding, whether it's TNC land or whatever, the Nature Conservancy that has snowshoeing cross country trails. It may not be groomed, but they've eliminated ATV and snowmobiling.
yeah, yeah,
So yeah,
yeah. I'm sure that's frustrated a lot of people.
yeah,
Um, so one thing I never got to mention, and I want to mention it in closing, is that you are also an exceptional outdoor photographer. And so, how might people if people are interested in this conversation, they think this Don Eno guy sounds like a pretty cool dude. How do they find you? How do they, see some of your
Yeah.
art?
Yeah. When I first started this photography thing, I used a real camera, a digital single lens reflex, which, let me tell you, is heavy to trail run with. So I really don't carry that anymore. But cell phones now have pretty good cameras. So um, I'm on Facebook. So Donald Eno, you can look that up. Instagram is, I think, Runner FK. I'd have to look that up because I don't look at my own Instagram very often.
You can
Uh,
send them to me, and I'll
yeah,
put them in the
yeah.
show
So
notes.
basically, those are the two. And I share a lot of photos with friends at Baxter State Park, which is a Facebook page. So Facebook and Instagram are where people could find my stories and photos, and then I'm on Strava and Garmin if anyone's interested in seeing where I've run or hiked. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
That's awesome, man. I appreciate you taking the time.
No, it's been fun. We gotta do some lunch again. You went and got a teaching career, and so you're busy correcting papers, and then you moved out of town, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah, we both got some things going on. Both of us with adult kids now, and if we had any thoughts of leaving Maine, those are long gone now, because now our kids are gonna start having kids soon.
yeah. We haven't even talked about country music, and you were in a country band. I used to go see you. I think we had a after concert road trip back to Fort Kent. Anyway, that's when we were young and wild. So
Yeah, we were
well,
crazy.
younger.
Younger. Well, man, God bless you, and I look forward to connecting with you soon. Face to
Thank you,
face.
sir. I appreciate the opportunity. It's a great chat.